is Alfred Hitchcock speaking. In the past, I have introduced you to many kinds of people. Murderers, thieves, swindlers, many of them geniuses at the business of crime. Now I'd like you to meet an entirely different person, an average sort of fellow, who leads a very normal life. The big difference is that his story is true. This is Manny Balistrero, tucked away at the rear of the bandstand at the Stork Club in New York. He lived in a simple, routine world. When the lights went out, the fiddle was put away. Then, the same subway, the newspaper, home, to Rose and the kids. Yes, Manny's life was straight and narrow until the night of January the 14th, 1953, when...
Is your name Christopher Emmanuel Balistrero?
Yes, it is.
I want to speak to you. We're police officers.
What about?
How do you explain it?
Made a mistake.
And so did the hold-up man. And it happens to be the same mistake.
If you see the man who was in your office on July the 9th in this court.
Yes,
You step down and point him out to us?
right there.
What twist of fate could take the quiet soul of a simple man and wring it into a shape like this?
Well, welcome once again to The Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York. There's little question that more and more Americans are experiencing an increasing coarseness and meanness to their lives and livelihoods, a further shredding of the social fabric and what's left of our democracy, a loss of their privacy and hard-won human and civil rights, and a growing fear and paranoia of each other, a belief that more violence, war, and environmental catastrophe will be an inevitable part of their lives. And of course, this is felt and played out in our criminal justice system as well. We're extremely pleased to welcome to the Radical Imagination two dedicated and talented practitioners and activists who are part of the Innocence Project, an organization that since 1992 has been shaking up the criminal justice world. Their subject was getting innocent people out of prison, cleared and liberated. Started by two former public defenders for the Legal Society, Barry Scheck and Peter Newfield, it now has a staff of more than 70 lawyers, paralegals, and other professionals, along with a rotating crew of students from Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. The project has become the hub of a national innocence network of law schools and reform efforts that has revolutionized criminal justice, changing law, investigatory practices, and perhaps most importantly, hearts and minds. We're thrilled to have Rebecca Brown, Director of Policy, and Vanessa Potkin, Director of Post-Conviction Litigation for the Innocence Project on the Radical Imagination. Vanessa, Rebecca, it's so great to have you here. I'm really happy you could make it, and tell us more about the Innocence Project here in this world of injustice. How did you get involved in this? You're Director of Policy, and you're Director of Post-Litigation Research, correct?
Right, so my
Yeah.
role at the Innocence Project is to...
Tell us first, what is the Innocence Project?
So the Innocence Project started in 1992
Right.
founded by Peter Neufeld and Barry Scheck, and at the time, they had just finished being public defenders in the Bronx. They were, confronted with a case where a client was maintaining their innocence, and they had heard about this new technology that was coming out, DNA, and really recognized that if this could be a tool that law enforcement uses to identify the perpetrator of the crime, well, defense attorneys could use it to help those people who are, snatched up into the criminal justice system, wrongfully accused, and ultimately wrongfully convicted.
The wrong man there.
The wrong man.
Alfred Hitchcock.
Yeah,
would say.
at one point, it's I think Alfred Hitchcock said, what twist of fate could, bring Manny into this circumstance, and the twist of fate is a criminal justice system that has gone completely awry. We now have 2.3 million people incarcerated. We just, we have so much volume in the system that there's just no way to get it right all the time. And there's other, systematic forces at play that actually are playing a big role in us getting it wrong many times. So far, to date, 350 people have been proven innocent with DNA testing.
So your organization is trying to hold this process somewhat accountable, in a sense, right? I mean, put some of the brakes on the excesses, and because, as you say, there's so many possible innocent people.
Right. So our core mission, we started off as a really small organization, as part of a legal clinic at Cardozo Law School. So students would take a criminal law clinic, and as part of their criminal law experience, they'd get 1 or 2 innocence cases that they took on. And it's grown tremendously since then, but, the heart of kind of what we do is still to exonerate wrongfully convicted people. So we still get 250 requests each month from people throughout the country who, sometimes are writing to us saying, help, I'm innocent. And, we have to go back and look at their case and try to screen it and see if we really can help them.
So it's thousands of people write to you, and that is probably what? Tip of the iceberg, too.
Tip of the iceberg, because we're talking about, we're focused almost exclusively on DNA. So we are looking at, when the crime was committed 20 years ago, did police collect some evidence that now we could DNA test and see if you are the wrong man or not? So that's the heart of what we do. But, we know there are 350 people who have been proven innocent with DNA testing. There's a national registry of exonerations, which keeps track of everybody who's been wrongfully convicted, whether you were proven innocent through DNA testing or some other means. And over 2,000 cases, are on the registry of people who went, were convicted and served time for crimes they didn't commit. And we do know that's the tip of the iceberg, because these are the felonies. These are the cases that people are, investing resources to overturn the conviction. But what about the hundreds of thousands of people who are, being picked up on these quality of life crimes,
like possibly Julio there.
Exactly.
Down in the schoolyard. And it's sort of ambiguous what in fact was wrong.
Right.
And what actually happened. There's a line there with the radical preach.
Yeah.
Getting him released. I guess that would be, maybe, you would be the radical preachers in this sense.
But we don't get to those misdemeanor cases,
You
because
don't.
what we
Let's
know
make
is
it
that
clear.
most people, we've turned, because we've gone from in the 70s and the 80s to a few 100,000 people being incarcerated to 2.3 million. We've also moved to a plea-based system. So about, depending on, state or federal, between 95 and 97% of people plead guilty to crimes. And so, if you're arrested on a misdemeanor, you've done completely nothing wrong, but you're in jail and you basically are offered time served if you plead guilty, you're going to walk out today, or you can stay in, in jail.
So how do you feel about that personally? I mean, that's
it's outrageous.
I mean, and so you're heading the policy part of this. What does that mean in terms of the entire organization? What sort of policies are you trying to recommend and advocate for?
Sure. I mean, I think, a big focus of our work is revealing wrongful convictions in the first place. So,
why is that so important again? Our basis, we're presumed innocent until proven guilty, but But the common feeling is that, you know, they're there, they deserve it, the hell with it, you know, serve the time and shut up, right? I mean, is that what we've become, this very mean-spirited culture that...
Well, I think
and we have a president, of course, who just in the last couple of days said, let's, you know, maybe, well, you know, rough them up a little more. You know, they're banging their heads on the police van. That's okay. Now, of course, he's since said, or the the spokesman Huckabee has said it's a joke, but what a sort of sick joke. But anyway,
Right.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Right. No, I
So,
mean, I think that
Yeah, it's a
you know,
very callous,
right.
unjust world out there.
Right, and I think, you know, the value of revealing wrongful convictions in many ways, first of all, of course, they change the lives of the individuals who are
Right.
stuck behind bars and their family
Absolutely.
members who are also tortured throughout that, but throughout the incarceration. But, you know, I would, and, you know, of course, it doesn't end the minute somebody walks out of prison. I mean,
Right.
their lives have been devastated in many ways, but I mean,
Absolutely.
it's not simply about the individuals, it's also about shining a light on a lot of the systemic problems that we see in our criminal justice system. I mean,
Right.
the U.S. is a leading incarcerator around the world. I mean, it is unbelievable how many people we're incarcerating. And
It gives us pause.
it should.
It should. Like, what the hell are we doing here?
That's
and,
right.
And how many, as you say, millions of people's lives and families are we ruining?
Right. I mean, just millions of people under supervision, under, you know, by the criminal justice system. I mean, we have 2.3 million people presently incarcerated. We have millions of people that are subjected to all sorts of supervision in their communities, electronic monitoring, parole, probation. I mean, people are really under a system of supervision in this country in astounding numbers. And we don't see anything like this around the world.
So let me understand again, you know, the policy part of it. Are you pushing for going beyond DNA evidence and so on? What are you attempting to get
Sure. I mean, you know,
you
so
know, the program to deal with?
right. I mean, so I think, you know, a number of things. So in terms of revealing wrongful convictions, not only are we trying to create mechanisms to prove innocence using DNA, but we're trying to do that also in non-DNA cases, right? So in many states, for instance, and each state framework is different, you know, getting back into court to prove your innocence is incredibly difficult when science evolves or our understanding of science evolves. So, for instance,
And according to Justice Scalia, what was his famous statement that this is not any sort of reason, it's unconstitutional.
Right, if you had a
Right.
fair
Right.
trial, innocence
Right, that was
doesn't
enough.
matter. You
Right.
could still execute the
even though
person.
you're
Right.
Yeah.
innocent, yeah, so wow.
right, sound logic.
How
but-
cold is that? Yeah.
I mean, so, I mean, and all the more reason then to have, you know, mechanisms to prove innocence. And, you know, and certainly as our understanding of science changes, you know, a lot of people are sitting behind bars out of luck, unable to get back into court to prove that. So we know, for instance, that some of the indicators that we used to use in the past to determine whether a fire was intentionally set has totally changed. And so, and a lot of the people who were convicted on old arson evidence are just out of luck, can't get back into court. So we're trying to do a lot of work in the policy realm just to reveal wrongful convictions, not only in service of those individuals, but also to show America, we've got a problem here. And actually, I think a lot of criminal justice reform has moved forward using innocence as a wedge, right? Innocence is the ultimate truth teller about what we are capable of, what our system is capable of. And then we also work a lot in our policy department to prevent wrongful convictions from happening in the first place. So changing how law enforcement does lineups, recording custodial interrogations, regulating the use of jailhouse informants, all of these things that have been shown to...
And snitches and so on.
Absolutely.
False confessions and stuff.
Yep, so recording interrogations is the single most important reform you can implement
Right.
against the power of a false confession, because it shows what happened in that interrogation room that led to that confession. So if there were deceptive or devious techniques used to elicit a confession, that will all be revealed on the videotape.
And so you worked very closely with policy directions. Is that correct?
That's right, because every exoneration that happens, you know, involves an opportunity to kind of galvanize the policy in the jurisdiction where the exoneration happens and try to, you know, push things forward. So the two are connected. A lot, it's the exonerations that really, you know, drive people to change.
You must have tremendous support, I would imagine, in the communities of people that you are helping here. I mean, in terms of a political force. Is that something you've noticed over the last few years in your work? I mean, the community support,
Yeah.
not just the individuals, but the thankfulness in the sense of somebody here really
I mean, I think
being on our
that's,
side.
I think that's right, because the truth is, nobody wants an innocent person to be in prison, right? So the work of the Innocence Project, I think, is something that, regardless of how you feel about the overall criminal justice system, most people agree on. Maybe not Scalia, but if you're innocent,
Well,
you shouldn't be in prison, right?
He's not speaking to us right now.
But it's our work is difficult with we represent people who were many of them convicted 20, 30 years ago. Some of them have lost complete contact with the outside world because their families have died.
Yeah.
It becomes too expensive to stay in contact. People move away. They can't go to the prison and visit. Some of our clients haven't had a visit in 20 years. And when you go to, one inside a prison in America and just see kind of how shut off people are from the rest of the world, it's unimaginable. But it's, it's crazy. We have a system where, many people are police officers or prosecutors and never have entered a prison where, their work is sending people. It's just, we don't have a great understanding of what's going on in this country. And, when it comes to kind of mean-spiritedness, we've come to a place where we criminalize everything. Something happens at a school with a 7-year-old kid and you see the police respond. We've just gotten we've gotten way out of whack.
And do you work with groups like the Correctional Association and other police groups, perhaps, that are open to this?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly...
Are the police interested in what you're doing as well? I mean,
some. I mean, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, which is probably the largest police association made up of law enforcement members, has been very reform-minded on our issues. They issued a model policy on eyewitness identification. They issued a model policy on proper interrogation methods. So, I think that there are certainly corners of pockets of law enforcement that, and leaders who are actually interested in moving the ball forward. I also think
making their own police officers more professionalized.
Exactly.
And you're helping them in that way.
Right. I mean, we've certainly conducted trainings in about half of the states on how to conduct good lineups, and and we've, and generally speaking, I think most everyone is resistant to change in whatever occupation they are in. But what we found is that once you explain the scientific basis for the reforms being sought, people tend to get it and come to understand that, in fact, they're not being criticized. Their integrity isn't being attacked. It's actually, in fact, when you want to have a blind administrator of a lineup, meaning the person who's administering the lineup doesn't know who the suspect is, when you call for that, sometimes the early reactions from law enforcement is, what, you don't trust me to do this right? You think I'm, purposely suggesting that they pick the wrong person? And we say, actually, a lot of the science shows that there are inadvertent cues that you might be providing, that you don't even know you're providing.
Such as?
Well, I mean, like nodding your head, or or I think more interestingly, if somebody selects the wrong person, they may say, well, take your time. Why don't you focus on everyone? Or if they pick the right person, they'll get immediate confirming feedback along the lines of, like, good job, you identified the suspect. Well, what we know is that uncertain witnesses, once they get that feedback, become incredibly confident in their identification. Their confidence can be artificially inflated, so that by the time they go to trial, they're 100% sure.
So you're getting into such very, very deep issues, profound structural racism here, and how different people are perceived, and if I may, how, in a sense, black bodies aren't seen as innocent as whites.
I think that's right.
And black children, adults, and so on. So how do you, so you're, in a sense, getting at that without fully saying it that way. Is that correct?
Well, I think, there's cognitive bias that plagues the entire system. And so, and this system, like most systems, are human systems. So what we often are trying to do is put into place reforms that sort of protect people from themselves, from their human factors, from the kind of, biases that they have inside of them. And the more that we can do to, for instance, blind a lineup procedure, or make sure that a test that's conducted in a crime lab is done, sort of in an unbiased, uncontaminated way, sort of free from influence, these are all good things. We need to do
Right.
everything that we can to sort of not let bias enter the
you
picture.
two are so knowledgeable, and I know our audience is also, but these are some technical issues that perhaps you could explain just a little more. In other words, untainted testing. I mean, what did you sort of mean by that? How does one handle tests in a way, in a safe way, so it's not tainted, I guess is what I'm trying to ask.
Well, I think one very interesting sort of feature of our criminal justice system is the fact that often crime labs regard law enforcement as their customers, right? That they're serving law enforcement
Right.
in sort of what should be independent scientific analyses. Instead of what should be independent scientific analyses. So I think kind of a lot of our work is focused on sort of reframing what that conversation even looks like. In fact, forensic analysts should be, completely divorced from the facts of the case, for instance, right? It shouldn't be, we think we've got a guy, conduct this test, right?
People
Interesting,
sometimes
yeah.
ask, well, now that there's DNA testing,
Right.
isn't that going to do away with wrongful convictions? And of course, it's not going to, because DNA is only available in a very small number of cases. It's estimated that less than 10% of violent crimes have any type of DNA that you could test in them. But aside from that,
Why is that the case again?
just because most cases, you don't leave biological evidence. If you have,
Okay.
a shooting and somebody walks by and does a shooting, there might, there's just no DNA left. I mean,
Okay.
oftentimes it's, murders and rapes and, these type of evidence, these type of cases that lend themselves more to some type of biological evidence being left. But, sometimes people do think that if we, if you just do DNA testing at the outset, we will always get it right. And that's just also not the case because of, what Rebecca was talking about, this notion of, confirmation bias or, tunnel vision in an investigation where police focus in on a suspect. And once they have that suspect, if they have an identification or a confession and there's some other type of evidence to send for testing, well, they're going to start to see as the relevant evidence any evidence that could inculpate that person. And kind of put blinders
the tunnel
on
vision,
what could
yeah.
exculpate them or
Right,
what
right,
gets
right.
to the truth.
Yeah,
And so,
yeah,
we'll get a case where, the crime happened in the day of DNA testing, but the prosecution was focused on just testing certain items of evidence, and other items that we see that, could really establish who the perpetrator was were never tested. So it's just, it's also, defenders, public defenders, for most people who are coming through the system, play a big role. They're up against, the power of the state and all the resources that the government has to bring a prosecution to fruition.
So you have to educate the prosecutors too.
Well,
Or how does that?
I mean, prosecutors
happen?
need to be educated, and overwhelming majority of them want to get it right. However, we do have a big problem in this country with, government misconduct and prosecutors not turning over evidence that is helpful to the defense as they are required to by the Constitution. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of accountability for prosecutors. And so right now, prosecutors can, hide evidence or present false evidence with pretty much absolute immunity.
Right. I mean, I would just echo that. I mean, some of our reforms are really aimed at really trying to make sure that the exact type of evidence that needs to be turned over is. So, if you talk about, jailhouse informants, for instance, some of the work that we're doing is really making sure that the, sort of elements that the defense should, the information that the defense should receive is received. For instance, if you're going to use a jailhouse informant, it's relevant to the defense how many times that person has been an informant in other cases. It's relevant, their level of criminality. There are so many pieces to the puzzle that are often not turned over to the defense, and then the defense can't adequately investigate that witness, and that witness is then used to wrongfully convict somebody. Someone else.
Right,
So we know
exactly.
from our cases, about 18% of our clients, there was a jailhouse informant in that case.
Really?
Which is stunning.
It
right?
is. It is.
And most often, any sort of impeaching information about that person was never handed over to the defense. So defenders had nothing to work with.
So It's sort of mind-boggling here to listen to what you're up against, in a sense, and the valiant job you're doing, you know, in the face of, as you say, millions of people, the overcriminalization. So do you sometimes feel like this is, you need many, many more people doing this? I mean, you have what, 70 people working? It sounds like you could use about 7,000, maybe 70,000, to really get. Well, let me ask you: if you had more resources and more people working toward this, do you think you could make an even larger dent? And what about the preventive measures that you could have by you know, not getting so many people in the system in the first place? Do you think that would be possible? Is it possible by just expanding your resources, or is the system too far gone in terms of fear-based retribution?
Well, I think we certainly need a reimagining of the whole criminal justice system. I mean, that, I think no one would.
Away from the idea of vengeance and punishment.
And what we criminalized in the first place.
And what we criminalized in the first place, right.
And a business. You know,
As
it's a big
profit-making
business.
business. Right.
So, I mean, it's
So
like all the values are off. But I think, you know, when you think about the fact that people, you know, the lion's share of people that are picked up in the criminal justice system are picked up on very low level, you know, offenses, which I would put in quotes because, you know, I mean, a lot,
Broken
you know.
windows.
Yeah.
Well,
Broken
right. And I
windows.
mean, what I even think about when I was a kid, I grew up in New York, you know, if there was a schoolyard fight, they would separate us and say, you walk that way, you walk that way, work it out. Today, the cops are called in. So, and, you know, and the cops are called into certain schools, right? They aren't called into, you know.
You weren't involved in a lot of fights, were you?
I'm going to take the
You
fifth.
had a couple, okay, all right. I'm just trying to imagine you. A couple of drawn-out fights. Anyway, but no, same here. I'm a New York kid, too, and you just let it go. I think, you know, some of the work that Michelle Alexander's obviously doing and Carl Hart to end the drug war and to see it as a public health issue. I mean, these are the sorts of steps we desperately need. And again, getting away from it as a business. And I like the way you put it, too, in terms of transformation of values. From what to what? We're talking more restorative justice, or we've had several people in this on this show talk about radical love, Cornel West and David Kim, and the idea that, you know, you stand for something, you stand for the downtrodden, that your radical love reaches out to people in the way that you're doing here, and that every individual can, in a sense, be redeemed.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think that our system, there's no place for redemption right now in our system.
Absolutely,
You know,
it's vengeance.
Yeah, we work on cases throughout the country, but if you take Louisiana, for example, you know, the mandatory sentence for an aggravated rape is life without the possibility of parole. So if you commit that crime when you're 18, it doesn't, you know, nothing is going to let you leave Angola prison. You will die there. And, you know, we, you know, end up representing people. Some of our clients come back and they have, the DNA confirms that they did what they were convicted of.
Right.
And they may have changed, they may have evolved, they may be different people, but it doesn't matter under the sentencing scheme, you know, what you did at 18, and no doubt that's a serious crime. Is it a crime worth the rest of your life? Are we saying as a society you can do one thing, one moment can define you for the rest of your life, and there's no redemption possible? We go into prisons all the time to meet our clients, and you just see so many people who are absent from their communities, who are people who could be productive members, who could be, you know, fathers, you know, to their family.
You've been doing this for years, right?
Yeah.
You go into these facilities.
Yeah.
It must tear you up.
It's horrible. It's awful because, you know, you represent clients who just, you know, want to make it home for their son's graduation from high school, or, you know, want to be there for these like really important moments in their family's lives, and can't be because, you know, they're kind of wasting away in prison, and, you know, you're calling around and you're trying to get testing done, and it's not a priority for anybody. You know, usually it's really slow with the prosecutor's offices and the courts, and nobody recognizes the humanity of who you're representing. They're just like, they're a number to the prison, they're a case to the prosecutors and to the, you know, many courts.
Well, they're non-entities. their humanity has been stripped.
Yeah.
They're a number, as you say. And so that's part of the whole process of dehumanization that you're fighting against. And what are some of the future goals of the Innocence Project as you look forward here? What are some of the things that you would like to see happen and work toward?
Well, a lot of our focus has been on serious violent felony crimes because, as Vanessa was saying before, that's where DNA, is going to give you answers. But we know, from our cases, that there are incredible pressures in the criminal justice system to plead guilty to crimes you didn't commit, to confess to crimes you didn't commit. And so we've learned, from our serious violent felony cases, just what those pressures are. And when you spread it across a vast system of 2.3 million people, you can imagine that those pressures make a lot more sense when the stakes are lower, right? If you're picked up on a low-level crime, of course you're going to plead out and not sit in detention to fight, a low-level case. You want to get home to your family. You don't want to be, you could lose your job. You could, lose your housing, so there are all sorts of incentives built into plead. So I think a lot of, our future work is really, I think, geared towards really sort of revealing that system, to the
structural, political, economic, and cultural negatives that people are, and so do you see yourself joining with, for example, we've had a lot of people on from the Poverty Initiative, Liz Thea Harris and Reverend Barber, William Barber, hooking up with the Poor People's Movement,
For
the new
sure.
Poor People's Movement that is now, because as we know, work of Jim Gilligan, the major variable that explains violent behavior is inequality, economic inequality. You see it across the world, and what that shame and humiliation and disrespect, how that all plays on largely these young males who are, in a sense, products of that. So it sounds like to me that what you're doing really has to, and it sounds like you are trying to expand it into these larger social movements that, which we may really have a chance to transform the system politically, economically, culturally, intellectually, spiritually.
Absolutely. I mean, Reverend Barber has already been very outspoken on these issues. I mean, he's been phenomenal. And I think, there are a lot of voices out there right now. I mean, I think when you said before, the system seems so insurmountable, I mean, the one thing that really does give me hope is that I think that there has been a sea change in sort of public perception in the criminal justice system. I think, when I was a kid, I don't think you heard many people say the criminal justice system is broken. And I think now you will hear that, even in the mainstream more. I mean, I think certainly communities of color and communities that have been afflicted by this stuff, they don't need education, but I think they're, in terms of America, in quotes, needs a big education. And I think we are really seeing a big change. I think that the social movements are growing. I think that,
True, but a lot of it is also financial too. People see it's just too expensive. Okay, so you take change wherever you can get it, but still it's not the sort of real structural change we're
I think
talking.
you're right, but I've actually even seen some changes on the right, that I think there is a sort of a values-based, faith-based sometimes move towards kind of reimagining how we treat criminality in our culture, or even if we are criminalizing certain things, like should we be criminalizing certain activities, behaviors, does that even make sense? I do think a lot of it is fiscally driven as well, but I mean, I think, I think across the board there's growing recognition that what we have is unsustainable and it's punishing. And I think, my hope is that, we can grow more into sort of looking at this from a values-based place, right? That this is actually wrong. This isn't what we want to do as a society.
It's not a liberal conservative, as Barbara would put it. It's just wrong. I've got to ask you this because, we met a few weeks ago and out in, you were giving a talk in Guildhall in East Hampton, and there were questions directed you well, and I remember one woman, right, said, well, we have a lot of money out here. What can we do? We just don't want to throw money at you. And so what about the transformation of values in these more privileged, if you will, communities and people who maybe for you at some level, but I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to ask you here. But I mean, you know, what is the response you get to these communities that, as I say, are more privileged and are wealthy and would like to help out, but you know, it's limited in a sense, their commitment, or is it?
I mean, I think a financial...
Sort of a semi-loaded question.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the actual Innocence Project and the work that we do, you know, financial support is essential because we don't get government money. You know, we are totally an, you know, independent nonprofit that, you know, receives money from private individuals and foundations. So that's, you know, where our budget comes from. So for us to be able to do the work, we do need that support. And I think that, you know, people should involve themselves where they can and seize opportunities where they can to either spread information or just, you know, if they own businesses, hire somebody who's formerly incarcerated. I mean, there's so many opportunities to get involved on, you know, smaller, larger scale ways.
Handle that very well. Yes, absolutely, I agree. But this more radical political economic transformation, Bernie might be drafted. There's going to be a conference September 8th to the 10th about possibly drafting him for a third party, People's Party. Would that be something that the Innocence Project could see as valuable for your own work in terms of creating a fair, more just economic system, political system? Is that
right?
Yeah.
No, I see what you're asking. I mean, you know, we tend not to get so involved in sort of electoral politics, and you know, I mean, we kind of deal with the hand that we're given a bit in terms of, you know, when we're trying to forge reforms. You know, it's really kind of who are the decision makers. All of that said, and while a lot of our work is sort of grass tops oriented and meeting with those kinds of, you know, with elected officials, you know, so much of our ability to be successful is galvanizing the public and really making sure that the public makes lawmakers know that they are educated about these issues, they're going to be following what lawmakers do. So I think an educated public is critically important to our success. We need it because the truth is...
Name names in New York here. The lawmakers that are helpful for you, that are
well, I
advocates.
mean, you know, frankly, it's a mixed bag, right? I mean, but I mean, Joe Lenthal, you know, has been a leader, you know, in New York State on, you know, criminal justice reform for years and years and years now. He is chair of the Codes Committee in the State Assembly, and he's just been a leader all the way through. And so I think that, you know, but I think truthfully what we need is a more educated public. When you begin to tell people about how broken the system is, they're shocked. For instance, in New York State, you know, we have one of the worst discovery laws in the country, meaning, you know, the material that the prosecution is supposed to hand over to the defense that's potentially exculpatory. You know, defenders are getting police reports, witness statements, witness names on the eve of trial. They're not in a position to...
Now, tell our audience, why is that the case? Why does that exist in supposedly this progressive state?
Well, I mean, it's just permitted statutorily. So, you know, frankly, the statute has to change and require that that information be turned over earlier. New York, it's called the blindfold law. Like, basically, defenders are going in and it's like trial by ambush. You know, they don't really know what's up.
And other states, like Texas, have adopted open file discovery, where you know the defense can just basically.
And that's because the public there has somehow been mobilized to push their lawmakers in this sort of way, or how would you explain?
I mean, I think there are a lot of factors. I mean, there were a lot of high-profile exoneration cases that came out of Texas. We did actually have, you know, the right-left connection was happening there. We had some very, I think, you know, our board chair was a state senator, is now a county commissioner in Texas, but was probably one of the most, I think he is the most successful progressive criminal justice reformer at the state level that I've ever seen. So I think he's just been very talented at sort of galvanizing change and policy change. So I think it was a bit of a perfect storm in Texas. But I mean, you know, you had counties in Texas producing more wrongful convictions, revealing more wrongful convictions in entire states. And by the way, it's not because they have a bigger problem necessarily with wrongful conviction. It's because they preserve the evidence in, some of those counties. So I guess all I'm saying is that there was sort of a perfect storm. There were a lot of exoneration cases. There was, I think, a very talented, policymaker sort of at the helm. And there really was interest from both the right and the left. And I mean, after all, a lot of our issues are appealing to conservative policymakers because it's the, taking somebody's liberty is the ultimate government overreach.
State intervention.
Right. I mean,
which
it's like a
is-
nightmare, right? So.
Yeah. There's right. What about the role of the law schools? Legal education.
So
How are we training our lawyers these days?
how are we training
Pre-law
lawyers?
students,
Well,
yeah.
I think that
Yeah.
the law clinics are good, and the Innocence Project is a clinic. Many of those other 70 innocence organizations, part of the Innocence Network, are based at law schools, and so it is. For us, the students are the heart and soul of what we do. The litigation was conceptualized around law students doing the work, calling around, trying to find the evidence, and so they play an integral role. That said, I mean, law school is very theoretical and not practical, and we do need to do a lot more in terms of lawyering on both sides, people who are going to become prosecutors or defense attorneys, because that is a pretty tremendous role to really hold somebody's liberty in your hands. And we don't really, do enough. Our system is supposed to be about getting to the truth, the right result, but there are a lot of incentives in the system. For prosecutors, you are acknowledged based on the convictions that you get, not how many dismissals, how many cases you dismiss because you don't think the police brought you a good case. And so we need, to reconceptualize what the roles are, what the responsibilities are.
Sounds like an ethical dilemma too.
It's an ethical dilemma. It's a financial dilemma. We have public defenders' offices. Look at New Orleans that have said we're not taking any more cases because we cannot meet our constitutional obligation to provide effective representation because we have too many cases. We don't have the resources. And when I think of a case that we handled of a man named Kennedy Brewer who was convicted of a horrible abduction, murder of a little girl who was his stepdaughter, who was 3.5 years old and abducted from the house and, brutally murdered. And he was convicted based on this bogus bite mark testimony where they just claimed that a mark on the little girl's body that we found out later, probably came from crayfish in the stream where her body was found. There was a dentist who said, that's a bite mark and I can match it to Kennedy Brewer's teeth to the exclusion of everybody else on the planet. Total garbage. And we ended up exonerating Kennedy Brewer and identifying the real perpetrator. But in that case, that crime happened in 1995. Kennedy Brewer lived in a little house that didn't even have functioning running water at the time. And here he is, arrested from this crime in his young 20s, and he's up against the state of Mississippi, all the resources that the, district attorney, can reach out, the Mississippi State Police, FBI, anything that the state wants to bring this case basically, to trial. And you have somebody who doesn't even have the resources to have water in their home, up against that and relying on a public defender who, in that circuit is, traveling around between different states. And, some public defenders are amazing and it's an issue of resources. And some people who go into, criminal defense don't really care about their clients. We see, people convicted at one-day trials and sent away for life.
There's such vengeance and anger at the poor in particular.
And this feeling that maybe you did this, maybe you didn't do this, but you did something else. Right. And, not really, people don't, there's no ability of a lot of the actors in the system to really empathize with, the people who are accused and convicted in the system of, what would it mean? What would it mean for you to spend one day in prison or be ripped away from your family?
So you have these events and you have people who have been wrongfully convicted speak to the audience. Does that move those in the way you're talking about?
I mean, I think that it often does.
This could have happened to me.
Well,
or
I mean,
did
I
begin to realize this.
That
wrongfully
would be the hope. I think that there are some people that still do not think it could happen to them, and I think that sometimes it's very telling the kinds of questions that even our clients get when they do speak, like, well, why were you a suspect in the first place, or or why was there?
Deep.
Yes, I mean, it's sort of, which kind of speaks to what Vanessa said. Sort of, if you didn't do this, you must have done that. In other words, an inability to see someone as innocent. Just that the perception of innocence doesn't attach to certain people in our society, and it does to others. And I think that that's another big part of our work, is sort of unpacking that and really kind of, sort of forcing some truth here, right? And I think the beauty of DNA is that it's a truth teller. But do people kind of go beyond that test and say to themselves, well, why was I so willing to just believe this person did this, or why did I think this person should have been a suspect in the first place?
Right.
I mean, it's always so fascinating for me to watch when somebody who's either, rich or powerful, or maybe a member of the law enforcement community, is accused of something. And, to watch kind of the cable news shows, and they're like, we can't rush to judgment here. We have to give them the benefit of the doubt. But then you'll see somebody like the Central Park jogger case, where, instantly those kids were guilty, and it's just not given any, nobody ever takes a step back and says, hey,
Trump
wait a
still
second.
Feels they are.
Yeah.
So it's like, we only have a few more minutes, but I did want to spend a minute or two, since one of your co-founders, Bershek, was involved in the OJ case. How did that case make some sort of impact on DNA?
Well, it made a huge impact on DNA in the sense that,
and our understanding of this a trial.
I think understanding a trial in the laboratory setting and in terms of standards for DNA, it was a monumental case, because before that time, there really weren't standards among laboratories on how evidence is collected, packaged, and there is a big serious issue with contamination, and biological evidence has to be handled properly, and so that case was very significant in kind of pushing forward, DNA.
Do you agree?
No, absolutely. I think it was a real eye-opener for people in terms of, like, just how much can go wrong at a crime scene. And, and I think in that sense, that perception can hopefully translate to our cases as well, right? That mistakes are made all the time. And, some of them careless, some of them intentional, and some of them totally unintentional. It doesn't matter. But we know at the end of the day, like, that can spell doom. And so I think it certainly brought a spotlight on sort of forensic problems.
And certainly there was a feeling by, some people, right, that the wrong verdict had been reached. And oh my God, the system is not fair. It doesn't always get it right, which of course, people who, have been wrongfully convicted or come from communities of color, like, have long understood the system doesn't get it right a lot of the time. And so, it was a message that came out of it, and it seemed like an awakening for people who felt that the truth didn't, a trial didn't produce the truth.
It feels good. What you're doing feels very, very good and necessary. And although it seems like it's taking longer than it needs to, you're really pushing the envelope in ways that absolutely need to be pushed. And I really want to thank you very, very much, both of you, for being here and doing such important, wonderful work as we seek to transform not just the criminal justice system, but the way in which we relate to each other. And again, the Innocence Project is a tremendous example of how we can move toward this. And that's what this show has always been about. So again, thank you, Vanessa and Rebecca, very, very much. And thank you all for listening to The Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and we'll see you again next week. Take care.